Final ending of the climb, other parts down below. Remember when we started meeting together? Asked he. He allowed the stillness to last for a time while both of his clients nodded. We agreed that either of you could say anything to the other that you needed to get out, right? This was to be a forum where either, or both, of you could say whatever you felt necessary. Mr. Houston looked over at Barbara. Mrs. Curtis, he replied informally, what do you have to say to your husband about the events that have transpired over the past week? Barbara gave him a questioning glance before turning to face Steve. For a long while, she remained silent. She then let the emotional dam to burst open. She yelled out, how could you? How could you do that to me? Steve didn't bother to pretend that she wasn't the target of some of his actions. He was not at all interested in hiding his intentions. Because you couldn't hear me when I said you did not understand the hurt and the empty feeling in my gut, he continued. You kept saying you did, but you didn't, sneeringly declared. Every day it was the same thing. You, your mom, or your dad. Someone was always telling me I was overreacting, that it wasn't all that serious, that I was making too much of it. Anything you were experiencing was darn petty beside what I was having to deal with, yet you kept at me. Well, you do know now, Steve remarked angrily. You now understand what it's like to have someone so lovely, so pure, and so immensely valuable taken from you. You do understand now, Barbara, what it's like to have an incredibly beautiful vision like that shattered. His fingers were twitching agitatedly on the chair arm as he leaned back in his seat and breathed heavily. Mr. Houston and Barbara both remained mute as they stared at him, thinking different things. You could have just brought Dad the videos. You didn't have to sleep with her, Barbara stated more composedly. It would have sufficed. Steve gave a nod of agreement. You're right, I could have, he replied. But in the middle of it all, sweetheart, you needed to lose something more. Kimberly lost her innocence, my wife died, and now this. For a minimum of 2 weekends, Steve informed her angrily, you lost your husband to your baby sister. Now we're all even. Everyone's hurting and nobody's winning. Barbara was staring at him, wondering if Steve had ever been this harsh before he'd caught her with Rafe. It was a concept that bothered her. She didn't realize he had the capacity to say such things. Moreover, Steve abruptly added, the bonding was only a small portion of the entire experience with your sister. Barbara did not ask him what he meant, but she did glance at him questioningly. Steve whispered quietly, don't you get it, Barbara? He questioned, did you watch all those videos? Barbara's face brightened to pink instantly. Just one, she murmured. You saw enough, Steve reassured her. You saw your little sister sleeping all those guys in every way she could, right? Barbara gave a nod. The memory of the film and Steve's words mortified her. She didn't want to add to his humiliation by criticizing the phrases he used. Barbara nodded briefly, her face flushing even redder. You saw her taking them all on, one at a time and in groups. And all the guys were doing it bareback the whole time, right? Do you think I wasn't doing the same thing? You know I hate the feel of protection on me, right? Barbara gave a pointed nod. Steve waited, but his spouse remained silent. He questioned, don't you get it, Barbara? Kimberly had no clue about safe bonding. She's probably got every transmitted disease known to mankind. And she gave them all to me. He returned to wait. Barbara, he grumbled, you know my medical history. I'm violently allergic to penicillin and every drug that is a derivative of it. I seriously doubt the docs will be able to cure what I've got churning around inside my body now. And if she's HIV positive, if she gave me AIDS, there's no hope at all, is there? With fear, Barbara turned to face her husband. She didn't remember. She was aware that when Steve was a newborn, a penicillin shot had been given for a far less serious illness, nearly killing him. She murmured, why? Steve shrugged tiredly, you didn't have to do that. Because I was tired of hurting all the time, Barbara. Because you wouldn't let me be. I couldn't get away and let any healing start. You kept the pain front and center in my mind all the time. If it's any consolation, I'm not sure I feel that way anymore. I wish I hadn't had slept with Kim. I'm ashamed of having done it. But when the opportunity happened, I was so damn depressed I couldn't see a way out. Steve sat up in his seat and gave the counselor a quick look. With a similar look of disbelief that his wife was displaying, Mr. Houston was staring back at him. Steve stood up and moved cautiously toward the door. Just as he pulled the door close, he turned back. Mr. Houston, I told you a long time ago that I was thinking about killing myself. You know I was. You wrote down some notes when I mentioned it. Well, I don't know for sure if I've killed myself by sleeping with my wife's sister, but at the time Kim was with me, I just didn't care, he repeated. He turned to face his wife and said, I'm sorry, Barbara, but it's too late now. He shut the door firmly yet softly and turned to go. Steve was shocked that Barbara had caught up to him in the parking lot outside, but it was only a little one compared to the earlier one about her entrance. Steve, hold on. Turning back, he saw his wife hurrying through the double doors leading from the parking lot to the ground floor, a determined, if not slightly irrational, look on her face as she approached him and gripped his arm. Are you done being sorry for yourself at this point? Barbara made a demand. Steve was half smiling at his wife and remained silent while he managed his temper, briefly considering responding with a retaliatory glare. Yes, I believe that I am, he muttered. Just this afternoon, he'd been concerned to find something of that within himself. He'd forced himself to face what he'd done in a deep depressive episode with Kimberly, squelching the poor me thoughts to nothing. Though there was nothing he could do about it now, he was more than a little regretful he'd done it and wished he hadn't exposed himself to all the STDs he assumed Kim carried. Barbara was extremely disturbed to learn that her husband had thought about suicide and that he might have successfully done so. She didn't know what to do about it because she hadn't thought of it beforehand and wasn't ready to deal with it, so she decided to just go ahead and do what she had planned to do tonight. Her eyes darted from one feature on his face to another, searching for some comfort that her husband was on an even keel. Espresso. With a firm gesture toward the Denny's across the street, she said. In passing, though, Steve wondered if he could have done it with her 3 weeks ago, clearing the air, so to speak, by having unguarded bonding with Kim and then admitting, well, it might have been just what he needed. Looking around the brightly lit restaurant, Steve shrugged his shoulders. Dealing with Barbara didn't bother him. Somewhere along the way, a confidence in himself he'd believed he'd lost forever was beginning to reassert itself. He was calm again, though the deep peace he'd had before the session began was gone. Barbara said to him, I want to come home, without much hesitation. Steve was taken aback by the fact that they had hardly settled into a booth in the corner. It was starting to catch on. Finally, he responded, I don't think that's a good idea. Nothing's changed, Barbara. Barbara shot out, the hell it hasn't. You've slept my sister 6 ways from Sunday, Steve. That eliminates all of the menial tasks I do for Mr. Raphael and then some, Mr. I believe that this is a great opportunity for us to review a few things. 2 hot cups of coffee were handed to them by the waitress, and Steve smiled and thanked her, taking a while to mix in 2 tablespoons of sugar until he finally ran out of ways to delay and glanced up at Barbara. You know, what I did doesn't undo anything you did, he remarked. You had already broken our vows to each other when I was with your sister. In my opinion, the moment you spent the first minute of that day alone with that guy, the marriage was deemed dissolved. Barbara came closer across the table, her words coming out in a whisper that Steve could understand. Her fingernail tapping the rough plastic tables. I've already apologized to you 1,000 times for all of that, she continued. I've told you I understand how wrong I was so many times I can't count, and I've admitted I was stupid and that I do not have any excuse for what I did. I can't be any sorrier than I am, Steve. I can't submerge myself any deeper in remorse, and I've done everything I can think of to get it through to you that I want to make it up to you by being the woman you want for the rest of our lives. That's all I can do, Steve. Can't you see that? She stopped. She noticed her husband's lack of resolve. Barbara angrily said, Damn you, Steve, we had some good years together. Are you so damn sure of yourself that you can throw it all away because of a few dumb things that make even me sick to my stomach? Can't you see I could never force myself to do them ever again? Steve leaned back in the firm bench chair, gazing lovingly at his spouse. She didn't seem dishonest. However, he'd been duped before. He began to speak, paused before he could say anything, cleared his throat with a slight cough, and tried again. No, he said, I'm not sure about much anymore, except that I can't bear the idea of you sharing yourself with another guy. That bonding was, to put it mildly, rather weird and dull, if that's the proper word. I'm also referring to the times you spent staring into space while sitting like a lump on the opposite end of the sofa and thinking about Raphael or someone else. I am referring to the kisses, small smiles, and touches that I did not receive. Every little thing you did for another man that you could have been doing with me is what I'm talking about. Barbara's eyes gleamed with moisture as she stooped to pick up her handbag from the ground beneath her feet. Taking out the standard tissue included in every woman's pocketbook, she gently wiped the corner of her eyes. I was a fool, I know, she admitted in a low voice. I miss those kinds of things so much because I liked sharing them with you. But in the last few months, you've distanced yourself from me. You're the one who prevented those quick kisses this time. The touches and grins. However, Steve, I don't care if we're equal anymore. Steve, all I want is those moments back. All you need to do is give me an opportunity. She put the tissue away, and this time Steve watched as she placed her purse on the seat next to her. Oh, I'm not sure, Barbara. He was interrupted by his spouse. What are you losing? Barbara inquired softly. Steve gave her a scowl, confused and unsteady for the zillionth time this evening. He took a sip of coffee. His tongue stung from the heat. It was still too hot. He quickly set the cup down, causing some spills on the table, which he cleaned up with a napkin. When he was done, Barbara said, well, she had observed the entire game without twitching an axon. Steve let out a quiet sigh to himself. In such a position, what the devil was a man meant to do? Everything was moving too quickly. His mind was racing. He had before anticipated a final divorce from his wife. He was certain that her hatred for him would grow and eventually cause her to let him go. An hour later, Barbara was pleading with him to forget all he had done over the previous 3 days, including what she had done to him, and to at least allow her to return. Her point was well made, according to his training, and he had a gut feeling that his spouse was deceiving him. He was perplexed. This was not the proper course of events. Barbara ought not to desire. He acknowledged it. She was accurate. Taking everything into account, he had nothing left to lose. Would it really make a difference? Besides, he'd already ejected her once. He was capable of it again. Not much would change. He answered, "All right," with caution. After a prolonged period of stillness, Barbara released a breath that she had been holding in for too long. She gave a tense smile. She took a minute to survey the restaurant, taken aback by Steve's acceptance of her proposition. "I'm hungry," she declared. Steve gave a blink. There was not a single thing that he could have predicted happening tonight. Conversely, though, "I could eat," he responded, nodding in agreement. Following their spontaneous late meal, they conversed for some time. They took care to avoid bringing up sensitive subjects. Despite everything that had happened over the past week and tonight, they both found themselves enjoying the small talk despite themselves. But both of them had to work tomorrow, and it was becoming late. The moment they were outside, Steve asked, "Do you want me to call you a cab?" It was cool enough at night to not be uncomfortable. Barbara cast a glance at him. "I told you I wanted to come home," she stated, "and you said yes." "You mean?" Before the protest could leave his lips, he gave up. It seems that all night long, he had been outwitted. Why should this transaction differ in any way? And the evening had begun so promisingly. As they got closer to his truck, he inquired, "What about your clothes? Don't you have to?" Barb gestured toward the passenger cabin. Steve peered. 2 large luggage were propped up on the wide bench seat. With a groan, he opened the door. He grumbled, "Pretty sure of yourself, aren't you?" It was difficult to get the bags over the high sidewalls and into the truck bed. They weighed a ton. "No," Barbara replied kindly, "but my non-why was certain of you." Steve glanced at her in shock, almost letting go of the second bag. He moved it to the other side and allowed it to fall onto the bed. Without a word, he turned away and paused halfway to the passenger side door. He corrected himself before asking the inquiry, saying, "Hey, oh, you never took my key," Barbara said in an unnecessary explanation. Her next words were softly, "I will need a new house key." "Exactly," Steve shrugged in response. Thoughts of the pickup's key had crossed his mind months earlier, but it had not seemed significant. Now that he was allowing her to move back in, the new house key was a certainty. He said, half resentfully, "Lydia was sure you could work me, huh?" He gestured for Barbara to come to the high seat after opening her door. "No," Barbara responded once he had entered and shut the door. "But she said you wouldn't allow yourself to be unreasonable beyond a certain point. She said you couldn't do that any more than you could sprout wings and fly. Nanwai has a lot of faith in you, you know." "She's pretty sure you hung the moon," Barbara replied to him. Steve enjoyed the refreshing nighttime air by rolling down his window. Steve murmured, "Nanwai is playing God again," right as he turned on the engine. At night, sound travels well, especially on hard pavement and in the absence of vehicle noise. The elderly woman, who was peacefully sitting in the darkened automobile, heard what he said. Lydia said, "I'm not playing God," as the pickup picked up speed and sped down the street. As the truck turned a corner, she watched it disappear. "I'm playing Cupid, you big lug. You just keep on being the man you are, and we'll all get through this without hurting each other too much more." Lydia, along with her occasional cook, handyman, driver, and gardener, had waited for hours in this spot while her favorite couple met with the counselor. Later, they watched the couple converse through the large windows of the brightly lit restaurant. They were now leaving together in their car. Even though Lydia and Barbara had made plans for it, Lydia hadn't dared to expect for it. "Phil, we can leave right now," Lydia remarked. "Say, you did say double overtime for this night work, right?" "Hi," shot back Lydia. "I said time and a half, you thief, and you're lucky to get that." "Yes, ma'am," Phil responded. He knew he was going to collect double money for the evening. Lydia had pledged only the smaller amount, but she did as well. Lydia would be regretting keeping him out and away from his family till late before they returned to her home. Phil drove with a smile on his face. Steve took Barbara's bags inside when they arrived home. Just inside the door, he hesitated a minute longer. Barbara wasn't. Moving up the hallway, she entered the main bedroom. Following her, Steve stood in the doorway while Barbara took in her surroundings. Nothing really seemed out of place to her. There were no unpleasant scents, the bed was made nicely, and the carpets had recently been vacuumed. A hint of cinnamon stick aroma wafted across the air. Steve loved that particular air freshener. She studied the bed carefully. Steve responded, "Never," standing in the doorway. Barbara gave a nod of approval. They generally did it on the carpeted floor in the living room, Kimberly had informed her. "If you want to sleep on the couch, I'll make it out into a bed," Steve said. "Don't even go there," Barbara retorted rapidly. She put her fists on her hips and turned to confront him. "You told me once you hadn't done a damn thing for me to make you sleep on the couch," she said. "Well, Buster, I haven't done a damn thing you haven't done too, and I'm going to sleep in my bed tonight. Is that all right with you?" she said belligerently. He questioned, "Did Nanwai tell you to say that too?" "Nope," she briskly replied. "That was all me," Steve answered, half smiling. "Okay," Steve said in a detached tone, "it's up to you, but we're not going to." Barbara gave a theatrical sniff. "That's something you can rely on," she told him. Steve gave a nod. Subtly, "Then we do have something we can agree on," he remarked. Releasing himself from the door, he headed to the kitchen to grab a Coke. He needed something to occupy himself while Barbara buttoned her clothes since his throat felt dry. Barbara had seemed aloof and indifferent, or overtly hostile, for a period of 8 or 9 months prior to Steve spotting her in the park with Raphael Porter. When they were apart, he'd become used to not even seeing her. The adjustment hadn't been all that challenging. It had been easier to adjust to her absence due to the fury. Subsequently, he was caught off guard when Barbara unexpectedly appeared on the night he had predicted would be the end of his marriage. He had believed that everything was neatly wrapped up and he could let go of it all. After discovering Kimberly's addiction and sleeping her, he had anticipated that his actions would be the final straw that ended their relationship. He had been perplexed when she shown only a fleeting anger before letting it drop. He had left the session at that very moment, of course, but still. After a while, she managed to catch up with him, convinced him to grab coffee, and gave reasoned arguments for her to be allowed back into the house. He hadn't thought of a counter-argument in advance. He could not stop wondering how he'd gotten himself into this situation. He assumed that because Barbara had returned, their relationship would revert to the cold one they'd shared at this time last year. Instead, when they were together, Barbara was kind and considerate. She took up the cooking completely and made it a point to frequently prepare his favorite meals. She even made the occasional call to him at work to check on him. Even though she was living in the same house, he had attempted to maintain some sort of separate existence, but that had ended after less than a week. He was compelled to reply to her amiable exchanges and growingly endearing grins. Barbara stayed within his comfort zone and withdrew when he became uncomfortable. She occasionally put them to the test with intentional caution, gleefully withdrawing when he refused. Over time, he allowed some of the barriers to reappear. He didn't try to stop it even though he knew it was happening. In many ways, Steve still kept her at arm's length. He refused to proceed beyond a certain degree. Specifically, he did not bond with Barbara, even if he had not contracted many STDs. He was very clear that he had no idea when or how that would happen. Thursday counseling for couples. He had no idea these two clients would make it this far. He had believed that during a session, they had battled to end their relationship amicably. Rather, Barbara had moved back in with Steve that very evening, and with his approval. It demonstrated to him the almost limitless potential of the human animal. He believed that the science of psychology was unable to adequately describe the functioning of human minds. A counselor's only chance was to help people identify a goal and maintain focus on it. Vern Houston turned to Steve's wife and said, "Steve, you've made enormous gains in ridding yourself of your anger against Barbara. I can see it's taken a monumental effort on your part and I know Barbara appreciates it. Barbara, you've made tremendous strides in extracting yourself from a murky, uncertain existence. You identified the fog you were in as being the primary factor for you pushing your husband away from you. That's taken a tremendous effort and I'm sure Steve has noticed the difference." That's where that was resolved, Vern considered. It was straight out of the handbook for licensed counselors. The book stated that each person should bring up something nice to establish the tone for a fresh conversation. Finding anything encouraging was difficult at times, especially with these two, but it had gotten easier over the previous month. Silently, he said, "Let's talk about forgiveness." He saw that Steve instantly rejected the subject with his body language. Vern questioned, "What does forgiveness mean to you, Barbara?" "Acceptance," was her prompt response. She glanced at her spouse across the space between their chairs. She said, "I've been thinking about it a lot. To me, it means a person recognizes someone else has done a wrong, but the person recognizes and accepts that someone is truly remorseful and will take the steps to see the wrong thing never happens again." "Steve?" asked Barbara's husband, posing a query. Steve answered slowly, Well, I guess I haven't been thinking too much about forgiveness or what it means. What Barb said is okay as far as it goes, but I just don't understand how her person can just ignore what the someone has done and accept it." Barbara firmly answered, "No," before Mr. Houston could continue. "By no means did I mean to tolerate wrongdoing in and of itself. It would also be wrong. What I intended was for the person to acknowledge that although the person did something wrong, they are essentially a nice person who made a stupid decision. It's that the individual considers that, in addition to how bad they feel about doing it and how determined they are to make sure, never permitting it to occur once more. Is that understandable to you, Steve?" Vern inquired as Steve cast a worried glance in Mr. Houston's direction. "Well, if I paid attention to every person, someone, something, and other detail." It took him a while to return to the counseling session as he stared at Mr. Houston for a moment without saying anything. He had a detached expression in his eyes. Steve said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, it makes sense, but what about that never occurring again thing? How possible?" "Oh, does anyone ever know that? Nobody ever can." "Got it." Steve glanced at his spouse before turning back to see their counselor. "Is it acceptable if I speak about us in place of?" "Yes." Vern and Barbara both gave the same response. After pausing for a time, Steve said, "Thanks," in a detached manner. "Well, to me, I wonder how I'll ever know for sure that Barb won't act in such a manner again. How will I ever be able to trust her again?" "Belief," Vern said. "Steve, is trust a prerequisite for forgiveness?" Steve gave the counselor a doubtful glance. He hesitantly answered, "I think so, but I'm willing to be talked out of it." "Barbara?" Vern inquired. "Not at all. With a short glance at her husband, she added, I think they are two separate things, speaking to the counselor rather than to her spouse. I'm a nice guy who did an awful thing, like I said, and I'll be sad for the rest of my life, but Steve might forgive me. Oh, she clenched her hands together and waited for Steve to say something, her eyes worried. He might never trust me again, she muttered softly. Steve gave her another look, but his demeanor was concerned. All right. He struggled to find the right words to describe his emotions before going silent. Finally, he remarked, all I know is I want back the woman I married. The little room was silent for a moment or two while Barbara fidgeted in her chair and bit her bottom lip, trying to figure out what it was she was supposed to be doing. Barbara, Mr. Houston inquired. Barbara angrily remarked, that's about the stupidest thing you could want, obviously referring to Steve. Steve, taken aback, shifted his weight onto the chair cushions and faced her squarely. Consider this, Steve, she stated firmly. You would be in for a great deal of misery if you could undo everything that has transpired over the past year and return us to our pre-marriage state. All of my issues, my immaturity, and everything else would still be there. Darn it all, I would simply be an affair waiting to happen. Do you not see that? Wouldn't it be better for me to understand myself a lot better and know how I leave myself vulnerable, and how a guy can insert himself into my emotion and my life? Wouldn't it be better for me to despise what I did so completely that I could never do it again? Isn't that a better way for me to be than that idiot you married, honey? Barbara turned to face her husband and begged for understanding with her words and eyes. Steve took a long time to appear convinced. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Eventually, he said, you know. His eyes hadn't opened yet. He spoke with a tired but relieved voice. If you keep using logic when we talk, all these conversations we're having with Mr. Houston are going to be awfully short. He sat up, grinning at the ceiling. With a hushed okay, he said, you're right. It would be a whole lot better if you had never done anything with those men. But since you did and we can't change that fact, I agree. I'd rather have a wife who knows what an awful thing it is she had done. He brooded for a brief space. But how do I know you won't do it again? How do I trust you again? I kind of feel like trust is like your virginity. Once it's gone. Permanently, right? Not necessarily, Vern said in response. Steve and Barbara sat back and waited for the counselor to continue. Excuse me, but let me explain something that's been the subject of a lot of research, okay? The counselor said. To put it simply, love and trust are the results of a sometimes long period of one person being with another person, he said as he waited and turned to face the two people he was attempting to assist. They were anticipating his next comment. That's it, he exclaimed with joy. That's all I had to say. He gave the pair in front of him a smile. He observed while they deliberated about his words. Steve breathed out deeply, grabbing Vern's attention. Okay, Steve replied slowly, you mean I can only learn to trust my wife again by being with her and learning to trust? Borrowing from what she said earlier, learning to trust who she is now. Mr. Houston smiled at Steve, as if he were a teacher addressing a very astute student who had just explained the challenging problem written on the board. The following afternoon, Lydia questioned her granddaughter, what he say about love. Barbara asked, perplexed, what did who say about love? You said the counselor said trust and love come about after a man and a woman are together for some time, Lydia calmly said. And Steve said he saw he might could learn to trust you after being with you for a long while, right? So, what did Steve say about loving you? Smelling, Barbara turned to face her grandmother. Close enough, I guess. Well, Steve didn't say anything about it, she said. He might not have heard Mr. Houston, she nervously suggested. Lydia said, oh, Tora poo-poo, with conviction. Yes, no, honey, your husband likes for other folks to underestimate him. He doesn't care for people to know how smart he is, but he would never have missed something like that. You know better than that. She struck her upper teeth with her fingernail. She pondered for a bit before saying, but he didn't rule it out either, did he? Yeah, I think that's a good sign, Barbie girl. If your hubby had a disagreement with what Mr. Houston said, he would have told you and Houston both and probably done it pretty forcefully too, if I know that boy. Lydia grinned. She continued to think, grinning, so, since he didn't, let's say the glass is half full instead of half empty. All right, she remarked quickly. Now, how do we fill that glass up, kid? Barbara appeared perplexed. Lydia tenderly patted Barbara's cheek. We got past one humongous hurdle, sugar. You're back home with him and, like your Mr. Houston said, that's awfully important. What we have to do is work a little bit harder and this man will be right back and love you in no time at all. So, what are you going to set up to make that happen? She said, hey, big guy, into her phone. Hey Barb, how are you? Steve asked. Despite himself, he sat back in his office chair and grinned into nothing. He was starting to look forward to his once or twice a day phone calls from his wife. Barbara remarked with a smile, I was thinking if you didn't have other plans, maybe you'd like to go to Ramon's tonight for dinner. Steve remained silent for a moment. Steve questioned, are you asking? Is this a date? Barbara snapped back, you bet your sweet ass it is, with a smile. She held out. Ramon sounds good, Steve remarked. Do I get to drive or will you pick me up? Questioned the man. Barbara detected the levity in his tone. You really ought to drive, she said. I've been having dreams about one of those big margaritas they have there. Steve shared her laughter. Sounds good. I'll be home about 6, okay. Barbara said, that's great, I'll make the reservations for 7:30 then. Her heart was humming. Steve stated, see you then, Barb. Talk to you later. With a bye, honey, Barb bid her. She briefly questioned whether she had gone too far, but all she heard was Steve hang up with a far-off click. She felt both discouraged and inspired. He hadn't returned the favor, but he hadn't declined it either. They were drawing nearer. This was just one more step toward her goal of making her husband fall in love with her anew. This evening was going to be fantastic. Nanwai assured her that it would be. Update: since the start of the year, he had been intermittently ill. Initially, he suffered from a severe virus that left him bedridden for 4 days and severely depleted of energy. He refused to stay down that long, even though it should have been longer. After that, Steve got a stomach virus that everyone said was going around, and while it didn't need him to miss work, it was obviously making him unhappy and preventing him from establishing any new acquaintances at work. He looked to be lacking vitality these days. He was perpetually fatigued and would frequently return from work feeling drained. He couldn't seem to get any sleep at all. Barbara was obsessed with thinking about her husband. He appeared to be growing increasingly ill just when their relationship was beginning to show signals of optimism. She believed she understood why. Barbara wasn't home when Steve got there. He had predicted she wouldn't be. She had informed him in the morning that she would be returning home about 10 p.m. after spending the evening with her grandma. She had offered, as she usually did, to occasionally contact him from her grandmother's phone while she was there, just to let him know that she was in fact there. Steve declined, as he consistently did. He assured her that he did not intend to treat her like a naughty child. On the way home, he indulged in a few drinks, something he had nearly given up throughout his protracted divorce. However, John, his brother, had called and asked Steve to meet him someplace. According to John, they weren't together frequently enough. Steve realized that what he truly needed was an update on his and Barbara's relationship. That was all right. He had never been able to open up this much before, but months of counseling had allowed him to do just that. Speaking with his brother in particular didn't bother him. When he eventually arrived home, he was hungry, exhausted, and starting to feel the effects of the liquor. He threw his briefcase onto the couch, keeping an eye on it to make sure it didn't fall to the ground. They could wait. There were some reports in there that he needed to discuss with Barb. The phone on the wall next to him rang as he was finishing up a couple of sandwiches and a handful of chips that he had dropped onto a dish in the kitchen. Unexpected as such, he took an involuntary breath. 2 potato chips, more or less, went down the wrong way. His voice was rough and gruff when he replied. Hello, he blurted out. Barbara worriedly inquired, honey, what's wrong? Her husband cleared his throat, and she listened. She could still hear the muted coughs even though he had covered the mouthpiece with his hand. Steve said in a strained voice, just eating some chips and a sandwich. He coughed again, cleared his throat, and tried again. That's where. Though the hoarseness persisted, his voice was stronger as he added, I think I'm all better. How are you doing? Barbara inquired. Yes, I choked on a potato chip when the phone rang, and it caught me off guard, Steve said. After a short while of conversation, Barbara handed the phone to Lydia, explaining that sometimes, even though Steve never inquired, it made Barbara feel better to have some confirmation of her whereabouts. After Lydia hung up, Steve completed his lunch, showered, and went to bed. When Barbara got home, she was still nervous, but Steve was sound asleep. The alcohol had taken its toll and he hardly stirred when she slipped into bed next to him. She stroked his shoulder and listened to his breathing, which sounded a little rough, and perhaps he was wheezing a little too. He'd dropped a good 10 pounds since the beginning of the year, so she glanced at his figure and knew something was seriously wrong, but he continued assuring her not to worry. He was back on South Padre Island, where he had been on his honeymoon when Barbara had pushed him flat on the beach blanket and they had slipped behind some sand dunes hand in hand. For the first time in many months, Steve laughed heartily and realized how much he had missed this feeling of being fully alive. Now, what was the purpose of that? In a quiet voice, he questioned his wife, who first remained silent. Barbara cried, I don't want you to die and leave me alone. Steve turned to his side and caressed her soft belly, the first time they'd felt a connection in almost a year, though they'd started to accept small, affectionate touches from each other since Barbara had moved back in. Despite not being fully awake after being startled so violently, Steve couldn't understand what she was saying. Steve awoke with a start and moved onto his elbow, astonished to see his wife quivering as she lay next to him. He didn't need to see her face since he knew it so well that he could imagine the tears welling up in her eyes. Barbara, what is the issue? He requested in a low voice, and his wife took some time to respond. She muttered, I don't want you to die, and I couldn't stand living without you, crying in between spasms. Now I'm going to die too. Steve's eyes widened in the darkness, words unable to express his awe. Steve, Barbara questioned quietly. What are you saying, honey? Distracted, he had been attempting to figure out how to start telling her what he had learned only today. Retain me. I'm really afraid, she pleaded. Steve leaned in and embraced her, pulling her onto his side so that their bodies were squeezed tightly together. He remained silent for a time before realizing he needed to speak cautiously. Listen, baby, you won't pass away. And I'm not either, please. He embraced her more tightly while she remained trembling in his arms. Listen to me, Barb, you won't pass away. I'm going to be here to annoy you until you're old and toothless and can't walk without a cane, he said, giving her a gentle shake. Do you get it? I am not going to die, and neither are you. Barbara fell silent in his embrace. But you've been really ill, you possess. I had a severe attack of the flu, which was followed by a contagious illness that one of the secretary's children had and I had, and then it was a demanding work week without lunch, honey. Beyond that, I have nothing more significant on my mind. He pondered for a while. I guess I look like a scarecrow, and I lost my appetite for a while. Or a skeleton, anything, but I'm all right now. Even after stuffing myself silly at supper, I was still ravenous when I came home. I think I'm going to go easy on potato chips though, he said, giving his wife another embrace. When Steve untangled his feet from the blankets and stood up, the bed rocked, and Barbara stopped shaking in his arms and took in all her husband was telling her, but she was confused. I'll be back soon, he assured her. After Steve hurriedly left the room, Barbara heard him switch on a lamp in the living room. She heard two snapping sounds, something thumping shut, and Steve turned off the light outside. A moment later, he was sitting next to her on the bed, clicking on the bedside lamp. Barbara was blinded by the brightness and kept blinking until she adjusted, raising her arms to her elbows. This was the night you always go visit your grandmother, Barbara, and I meant to tell you this tonight, Steve clarified. He gestured at her with an official-looking form. Honey, I'm not HIV positive, he declared sincerely. Moreover, 3 months have passed since then, since I become aware of it, and none of the antibodies are visible. Dr. Macmillan only informed me this afternoon. He looked closely at Barbara's face, trying to read her thoughts. The physician informed me that HIV manifests itself between 96 and 97% of the time. Oh, he indicated it was between 2 and 12 weeks following exposure. Barbara, I'm totally over that. While there are extremely rare instances in which it won't manifest till the 6-month mark, Dr. Mack doesn't seem to care about it in my opinion. The likelihood that I may test positive going forward is as high as that of being struck by a meteor, he remarked. Do you get it, honey? I'm not HIV positive, and I'm not going to give it to you. Barbara reclined on the pillow and took a moment to stare at the ceiling. Could you not have informed me sooner? She spoke with a hint of bitterness. Steve snapped back, I was asleep, reminding her, I didn't know it couldn't wait until morning. Barbara, his conciliatory tone making it impossible for her to argue with the logic. And they've eliminated all the other STDs and I'm clean ever since they gave me that shot desensitizing me to penicillin. Whoa, also, all of Kim's have been called by the county health department. Oh, relationships, each of whom has tested negative for HIV. After having slept with someone outside of their little group, all of them have gone past the 6-month mark. You know, honey, they've been carrying around a witch's brew of sexually transmitted diseases, but AIDS isn't one of them. He bided his time, waiting for Barbara to process all he had spoken. Do we not expect to die? She muttered. Not anytime soon, Steve reassured her. Barbara cried out, oh God, you must think I'm such a fool. She covered her eyes with her right forearm to conceal from her husband. After holding his breath to see how she would respond, Steve released it with a huff. Not at all. No, sweetheart, I don't. After shutting off the light, he returned to his bed. But we definitely need to talk about things, he said. What? Barbara inquired, feeling cozy in her spouse's embrace after missing their company. By just feigning irritation at her breaching their agreement to wait for mutual consent before sharing a bed, he had sidelined the process of establishing guidelines and requirements for cohabiting in what he still saw as an in-house split. Examining it, he saw that notion had been superseded. Somewhere along the line, he'd unintentionally moved over from not wanting and not thinking that reconciliation was possible to wishing that it was. It made him feel dejected and like he was no longer in charge of his own destiny. So, let's talk about forgiveness again this evening, Vern Houston offered, in light of you two having made love last night. Steve was hoping for a different course for the conversation. He had been contemplating the consequences of his and Barbara's actions all day. The more he thought about the affair and the circumstances surrounding it, the less confident he felt that he understood Barbara's adultery and his response. Barbara, asked Houston. Barbara took a long, dubious glance at the counselor. Well, as we discussed it then, she continued slowly, it's about having a profound sense of regret and accepting that a decent person can make a wrong decision, among other things. It's true that we have essentially defined it. Steve, are you in agreement? Steve gave a nod. He reminded Mr. Houston, but I still have questions about some things related to forgiving someone. The counselor swiftly replied, understood. We'll get to them, but for now, I'd like to hear a discussion of just one subject. Steve hesitated for a second before nodding. Barbara, Mr. Houston began, facing her once more. Have you asked Steve for forgiveness? Steve snapped. She doesn't have to ask for my forgiveness. I didn't say beg, Vern shot back almost as fast. He'd been prepared for the remark, even though in many of his cases it came from the wayward spouse. It was encouraging that Steve's first response had been to stand up for his wife. Vern said, I said asked, and returned his focus to Barbara. Are you? He politely inquired. Barbara hesitated, shook her head, moistened her lips with a trembling tongue, waited for Mr. Houston to continue, but he said nothing. And when Barbara turned to face Steve, he was observing her closely. "Steve," she muttered, "I have been a huge fool. I've taken actions a woman is never, ever able to take. And I despise myself for doing them. I'm not sure how to express my regret for everything regarding the awful." "Yes," Steve muttered. "What?" Barbara spoke hesitantly. Steve inhaled deeply and exhaled. He was pretty sure he was screwing up badly. He spoke carefully and realized that he didn't want to list all the wrongs he thought she had done. "I forgive you for the lies, the deceit, all the things you've done," he murmured. "I won't forget them anytime soon, maybe never, but I see how sorry, how remorseful you are, and I accept that." He started to say something, then changed his mind. Rather, he extended his arm to grasp his wife's hand through the space between their seats. He gave it a light squeeze. Vern Houston waited a while to act, allowing the scene to unfold. "Steve," he murmured, "have you asked Barbara to forgive you for the hurt you've caused her?" Unconsciously, Steve's hold on his wife's fingers became more firm. Steve observed the counselor behind the large desk, and his eyes contracted to slits. Vern asked softly, "For the hurt, Steve?" The room fell silent for a considerable amount of time as Steve thought about the counselor's question. Steve's gaze drifted off as he considered what Mr. Houston had said. He hesitantly responded, "I'm sorry for shattering the impression you had of your baby sister, Barb. I think it had to be done. She was doing things that would destroy herself in time. But I didn't need to do it the way I did," he said. "I wanted you to know how it felt to have something beautiful destroyed. But that was wrong of me. I should have found a better way to expose what she was doing to your parents." Steve was silent for quite some time. The confusion in his head was reflected in his expression. He stopped Barbara before she could say anything by raising his hand. "I will also be eternally sorry for sleeping with her, Barbara," he stated gently. He glanced at Barbara for the first time, then said, "It was part of wanting you to feel the same loss I had, but I shouldn't have done it. You were the last person I ever imagined we would speak to again, and I believe that having a sexual relationship with her was my way of finally getting over you. And maybe ending my life too," he thought to himself. "I'm not sure if I was really trying to do that or if I was just accepting the possibility without thinking about the repercussions or anything else. I simply stopped caring because I was so darn depressed," he continued. Steve inhaled deeply once more and exhaled gradually. "Even if I considered the marriage over, I didn't have the right to do that, and I wish I hadn't done it. I know it wasn't right to have slept with her," he replied. He was having trouble finding the right words to say something different. Barbara calmly stated, "I believed you knew. I forgive you for all of that. I forgive you before our first counseling session after I found out. I came to terms with the fact that you had slept with Kimberly because you were so hopeless that you couldn't help yourself. That night when I returned home, I noticed that. I no longer even give it a second thought." Steve fixed her with his intense gaze. They had never talked about anything connected to his romance with Kimberly. "Have you never wondered?" Barbara questioned him. "All right. Yes," Steve replied, "but I didn't really care why you didn't seem to despise me for it all for a long while. To be honest, I was annoyed that you didn't detest me so we could quickly finalize our divorce," he snorted. He gave his wife a direct glance. "I was foolish too, Barbara. I don't feel that way anymore," he remarked. "I was responding to what you had done, but I was naive to believe that I could ever feel that way." Barbara briskly responded, "It's over and done with now," after a little pause. Steve looked away, understanding what she was saying and the spirit in which it had been provided, but still staring at her. "One day," he remarked, "I hope I can say the same." Barbara nodded and smiled slightly, masking her disappointment. She'd hoped, but she wasn't willing to undo the progress she felt she'd made over the last several days with her husband by pushing him quicker than he felt comfortable going. "I think you've got your man back, young lady," Lydia said. "It wasn't easy and he fought it as hard as he could, but you're his woman again and he's your man." Thoughtfully glancing at her grandma, Barbara wasn't entirely convinced that everything was moving in the correct direction. Many issues remained to be resolved. "Child, what is it?" Observing her granddaughter's look, Lydia inquired. Before responding, Barb bit her bottom lip for a few moments. Finally, Barbara replied, "It's something Steve mentioned in a session a long time ago. He stated the last time he'd had really excellent bonding with me was several months following our honeymoon, about." She cast a somber glance at her grandma and said, "Nan, why would he say that?" "Well, Barbie, that's unlikely, but could it be that that's how he felt?" "Nan, why?" Barbara reprimanded, "That's not very kind." Lydia laughed. "Occasionally, my dear, connecting isn't pleasant. At times, it feels sweltering, unkempt, and overheated. And just awful," Lydia said. Unsure of what to say next, Barbara glanced at her grandmother with uncertainty. Her non-Y had assured her they could talk about anything about anyone, but she felt this conversation might quickly spiral out of hand. "How was it the first time you and Steve made love again?" I could see Barb didn't know how to approach a topic that had been bothering her for a while, Lydia said, feeling sorry for her granddaughter. Barbara said, "He was so gentle and loving and kind. Beautiful, right away. I thought I had never felt so well in my life when we arrived. And since the two of you were already in bed, the lights were off. Barbara gave another brief nod. Like you are practically constantly when you're making love to Steve. Nanwai looked like the cat that had just swallowed the canary, and Barbara suspected that Nanwai was up to something. She stared at her grandma for a long while before gently nodding. Lydia got up and went to the window to take a brief look outside. Barbara assumed her grandma was thinking back on all the information she had been given. The details Barbara felt were too personal to share with anyone else. All right, when was the last time Steve screwed your brains out and bent you over the kitchen table? Lydia asked, hastily turning around. After a moment, Barbara let out a gasp. Nanwai, she exclaimed, horrified by her grandmother's inquiry. Half the joy of being older was frightening the living daylights out of the younger generation. Lydia laughed happily. All right, Lydia questioned, not willing to back down. Barbara mumbled, a long time, in response. Since your trip abroad, Lydia posed a challenge. Almost, the younger woman replied, her voice barely audible above a whisper as the dark red on her neck began to spread upward despite her best efforts to contain it. Lydia chuckled. Since it's too unpleasant. Barbara shook her head and asked. She defiantly said, Steve, stop asking me to do things like that. That's probably because he could see you weren't very willing, Lydia murmured. What need does he have to ask you for bonding, then? Why don't you just drop on top of him and knock him down on the couch? Barbara's face had turned scarlet now. When was the last time you made him feel happy? Overwhelmed, Barbara could only shake her head at every question her grandma asked. When she was silent, the implications of all the inquiries became obvious, and Barbara hung her head. Am I really that impolite? It's not like I wouldn't let Steve, she hesitantly questioned. Lydia gave a soft smile. Child, if it's not offered freely, perhaps he just gave up on you liking it too and stopped requesting. But I like it, Nanwai, Barbara objected. But Steve ought to be the one to. Her grandmother gave a forceful shake of her head. If your mother just started letting her hair down before she turned 40, then I blame her for this, Lydia murmured to herself. All right, forget it. We'll work on it, if you want to. We can talk about the difference between making love, loving bonding, and some good old raunchy bonding that's just for fun, Lydia replied. With excitement, Barbara nodded. I do want to, Nanwai. Work on it, that is. Ever since Steve caught me and gave me hell for being a jackass, I've wanted him so bad I ache sometimes. We've only done it a couple of times since I moved back home. If you'd only. The other day at work, Nanwai, I started thinking about him and I wanted to just call him and meet him somewhere. Barbara reddened and distanced herself. Lydia chuckled. Then, she reassured her granddaughter, it's not too late. All you really need is a little knowledge, perhaps even a spark, but where to begin? All right, she moaned, I guess you just have to go all in. Barbie, come with me. I have some items that you should view, but your mother will not see them if she knows I have them. Actually, now that I think about it, she might want to borrow them, which is not going to happen. Barbara went with her grandmother to the master bedroom upstairs, where Lydia unlocked the lower drawer of her bureau and started pulling out DVDs, VHS cassettes, and other unknown devices, before a few pieces of plastic that Barbara recognized emerged. Nanwai. Lydia merely laughed, but Barbara spoke up, scandalized. Lydia warned her granddaughter, child, you got a lot to learn and not much time to do it. Now, you take these videos home and you watch them. They'll give you some excellent suggestions. A few, but not many. Videos are all about strange camera angles and awkward poses where individuals can't truly bond well. However, these will likely put you and any male in the right mood as well. They certainly do for me. Nanwai, Barbara muttered to herself. She recognized the assortment of toys for what they were, unwanted, a vision of her grandmother using one, and she wasn't sure whether to laugh nervously or cover her eyes to avoid seeing the pornographically illustrated covers on the DVDs and cassettes. If she didn't take control of herself pretty darn quickly, the blush on her face would remain permanent. She picked up a weirdly shaped piece of clear blue plastic to hide her surprise. Nanwai, what is this? May I ask? She inquired. Honey, that's a plug, she said as she emptied her drawer of all the toys and accessories without stopping. Barbara placed the inoffensive plastic piece on her grandmother's bed, and Lydia cast a pitying glance at her granddaughter. A moment later, Barbara surprised herself by racing eagerly down the stairs to meet up with her grandma despite feeling a bit lightheaded. Hello, Elaine, and how are you? The gorgeous young woman sat down, and Steve greeted her. All right, thanks. What say you? It was her response. They got coffee, none of them was hungry, their recent meetings had been brief, but their previous ones had been long, filled with small chat and mutual support. They didn't need long dinners or that much support these days. Steve said, doing pretty darn good, everything considered, and showed how well he believed things were going with a lazy, laid-back smile. I've pulled the divorce paperwork, said Steve, who had been putting off taking that action for a while despite having been instructing his lawyer not to pursue the case since November. Elaine said with enthusiasm, good for you. It's about time you came to your senses. Steve was shocked. His wife had an affair with Elaine's husband. It had started out as mainly an emotional affair, but had been building up to a full-blown physical one when Steve had blown apart the adulterer's little fantasy world. Elaine shouldn't be this happy that Barbara wouldn't have to go through a traumatic divorce, in Steve's opinion. Steve said, "That's nice of you," and Elaine smiled. "Do you think I ought to wish for her to endure a little more pain?" "Well, something similar," Steve acknowledged. "Yes, you certainly gave her hell there for a bit. A few months' worth. And based on what you've told me, she has tried her hardest to alter her behavior. I'm not particularly interested in seeing her get thrashed. That is, until now." Elaine smiled. When Steve and Elaine had first met, she had been quite sure that Barbara and Elaine's husband had needed precisely that. After going through a lot over the past 6 months, Steve and Elaine had rarely felt like smiling. Steve smiled back. Elaine ventured, "Rafe's coming around too," and for a little while spooned another teaspoon of sugar into her coffee cup before gazing up once more. "You know, he's not being considered as a candidate for city council anymore." Steve nodded. He knew that. When the scandal first surfaced, the Democrats had dumped him like a hot potato. The party leadership didn't want to draw attention to themselves with a shoddy nominee, especially since the investigation into the former mayor's indiscretion and subsequent perjury charge was set to be reported back to Congress. Steve said, and the insurance company refused to pay for his Thunderbird. Elaine huffed and nodded. In any case, he didn't need that stupid car. When he bought the car, I warned him it was foolish to acquire a vehicle that could only fit 2 passengers inside. Elaine took a moment to let her annoyance subside. When Elaine replied, "Well, anyway, he also turned down a better job at the regional headquarters," she was adding to the hot coffee while stirring the sugar thoroughly. "I told him he needed to spend more time with me and our daughter and asked him how he was going to do that if he accepted a more stressful time," she said. "It was a test of sorts," she acknowledged. "Oh, laborious task." She raised her head. She remarked, "I couldn't ask for a better man for a husband. He passed the test pretty well and is working hard to be a better father to our little girl. Recently, that is." She nibbled on her lower lip. "The thing is," Steve laid his hand across hers on the table, "in order for him to spend more time with you and your young girl, do you now need to be present?" He inquired. "Yes," Elaine replied with gratitude. "And this is going to be our final conversation together?" Steve inquired. "Yes," Elaine replied, her face looking dejected. Steve gave her a gentle hand stroke and grinned. "Well, it's time," he remarked softly. "Elaine, I'm happy for you. I am, truly." Once the coffee was finished, they left their waitress a $20 bill for the coffee and a large tip on the table and walked out, hugging one last time outside before heading back to their spouses. They talked for another 20 minutes, wrapping up a number of topics they'd started talking about over the months but not finished. It was kind of touching when a policewoman entered the cafe and saw them as a brother and sister having to say goodbye for a while. Update: I am genuinely in awe of the progress you two have made in the past month, and a large portion of that progress has been made while you two have worked without my assistance. That indicates to me that you two are once again able to communicate and that things are going well. That makes me really happy." The therapist gave the couple a prolonged look. "How about if we only got together every 2 weeks? Let's see how it goes for, say, 3 weeks. He questioned them. Steve and Barbara exchanged a look, and after living together for a while, Steve furrowed his brow slightly and read something in his wife's eyes. Barbara didn't object, and Vern laughed to himself that their subtle nonverbal cues were working well once more. "That seems reasonable," Steve responded on their behalf. "If necessary, we can always return to a more regular schedule, right?" Mr. Houston gave a nod. "Then we'll schedule it for every 3 weeks, Vern said quickly. "Okay," he responded. "Are Thursday nights still beneficial for all of us?" "All right, just let me." After pressing a button on his phone and waiting, the counselor scowled when he didn't hear back. He tried again, but still didn't get a response. He stood up and said, "Give me a minute. The damned intercom has never actually worked well. Just give me a moment." Hurrying into the outer office, he said, "It's not necessary for us to discuss significant issues only with him, is it?" When they were alone, Steve asked his wife. Barbara firmly shook her head. "We're both adults," she asserted. "We can recognize when the other is getting too irate and take a break or something else." Steve gave a nod. He said, "That's about how I see it," and they both fell silent for a bit. Barbara dared to say, "Kim said to say hi," which startled Steve. She succeeded. "When was that spoken by her?" he inquired. Barbara stated, "This morning, before I went to work, she called from Dallas." Steve nodded, pausing for a second before deciding to just speak what was on his mind. "Is she upset with me still?" Barbara chuckled. "Not at all. She told her husband she wanted really bad to cut your heart out for a while there, but she's okay now. She got over that a long time ago." Barbara said, "Kim has been receiving a lot of really intense counseling, and she sees that she was going down an awfully dark road. She's almost at the point where she's ready to tell you how much you cared to stop it dead. You would actually be surprised at the amount of baggage she has carried about since she was just 6 years old. You know that Mom and Dad's little kids have been 2 messed up puppies." Barbara shook her head in confusion. "All right, I told your folks about it for reasons other than the dark road issue," Steve murmured. "I'm still not happy with what I did to." Barbara reminded him, "We agreed we didn't need to discuss that again." Steve sighed. "Yeah, but sometimes I feel like such an ass with her." and then having a conversation like I did with your folks. Barbara gave him a consoling touch on the hand. Hey, you're pardoned by all three of them. You're aware of it, she said. Yes, I understand, Steve retorted quietly. There are moments when I wish your parents would spit in my face for the way they treated me when we visited them for Christmas. Okay, if your dad had smacked me across the face instead of shaking my hand, I never would have faulted him. Well, after Nanwai had a long talk with them and pointed out Kim was just a step away from overdosing or catching her death of disease, they were willing to be a little more compassionate than they would have otherwise, Barbara said to him. Nanwai talked Dad into hiring that investigator to make sure all of those amateur tapes of Kim's were accounted for, you know. They never did find any more of them after that one guy in the first video you say you saw gave his copy up. Nothing ever showed up on the internet either, so it looks like all that is going to go away. Steve said, Your Nanwai has really been working hard in all of this, after a while. He was not fond of talking about Kim's videotapes. You've been seeing an awful lot of her the past few weeks, haven't you? He asked indifferently. Yeah, Barbara responded. Her speech carried a faint note of apprehension. Steve nodded in agreement. She's good for me, don't you think? Barbara said to him, Nanwai likes you an awful lot. Steve grinned. He also thought highly of Barbara's grandmother. Vern bustled back in the door. Okay, said. Shelly has got it set up for you to be here every third Thursday for the next 2 months. And then we'll reevaluate, okay. Steve said, sounds good, and glanced at Barbara. She gave a nod. Outstanding, the advisor remarked. He smiled broadly at them both. So what shall we talk about tonight? Inquired the man. Are there any questions that haven't been answered in your mind? Steve moved in an awkward way. I really don't want to. No, Barbara angrily exclaimed. Let's get everything out in the open and talk it all out now, Steve. We don't want for something to come at us out of nowhere 10 years from now just because you didn't want to rock the boat now. Her face relaxed. Barbara said, whatever you need to know, okay, Steve. Steve answered, all right, very slowly. I've got a handle on pretty much all of it. I understand how you were vulnerable and everything a couple of times in your life. I accept. It hurts and I don't completely understand it. But I accept that you felt you couldn't come to me with your doubts and all. I think I need to talk more about that in the future, if it's all right with everyone. Barbara gave a nod. But I think that what bothers me most, after the shock of you becoming involved with those 2 men after we got married, the thing that bothers me most is just when did you decide that it was okay to do that, Barbara? How did something you knew to be completely wrong turn into something that was okay? I just don't understand how that can happen, Barb, honey. Are you forgetting about Thad Brown? Before we got married, Barbara responded. Steve was caught off guard by the question. His thoughts caused his eyes to go off focus. Steve finally answered, no, I'm not forgetting about him. That occurred before to our marriage. I was persuaded by you a few weeks ago that you were actually saying goodbye to him. We hadn't exchanged vows when you canceled a date with me and lied about where you would be and what you were going to do. We didn't see each other for 6 months after I dumped you, and that was enough. That's resolved now. I would not classify Thad Brown with Jimmy Roberts or Raphael Porter. I simply counted everything that time using him. All of mine, though, complaints, if you will. Barbara gave a firm nod. With a timid smile, she blew out her air and muttered, thank you, to her husband. I assumed he was no longer involved in this. She paused to gather her thoughts. I was sure I knew it was Jimmy and Rafe that were still bothering you. To start with, I never made the decision to associate with someone else. I've never wanted to take action. Oh my, it's still so difficult to discuss. Yes, I was aware that it was wrong, but I never allowed myself to consider the possible consequences or what it might cost. It was only about getting an immediate emotional boost for whatever was bothering me at the time. It still bothers me to think about why I needed that emotional support and couldn't see that you were there to provide it. She grasped Steve's hand in hers, as she felt comfortable doing these days. Steve did not push away or object. Instead, they were working through an issue together. Barbara spoke slowly and continued, I didn't decide to cheat on you at any one time. It was never going to be easy using the word that characterized what she'd done, and she detested it, so she'd had to steel herself before speaking it. She mutely remarked, it took months to get there, a little bit at a time. 100 little steps toward a place I had no idea I was headed. I eventually realized that I was doing something incorrectly, but at that point, my reasoning was not at all apparent. It was all so disorganized. I had been bewildered and lost for about a year, and I really let things get away from me, particularly following my miscarriage. What I needed emotionally for a while was taken care of by Jimmy Roberts and Raphael Porter. You stopped Jimmy cold before I could make a worse mistake than just listening to him. I just wish you could have done the same with Rafe too. I let other men flatter me, tell me I was still beautiful, desirable, smart, whatever you name. I have informed you. When you were telling me all those things too, I was not listening. Baby, I was mistaken. I was naive and failed to hear you. For some strange reason, I felt that you were only telling me those things because you had to. And I have no idea why I believed that. And, Steve, I believe that my maturity was underestimated. I was insecure, lazy, and didn't even realize that I needed to work on our relationship. I just assumed that happily ever after would happen naturally because two people would always love each other. When we had our first argument, I was so shocked and devastated that I didn't know what to say or who to talk to. As a child, all I witnessed was my parents' constant good relationship. I never saw them argue or become upset. That seemed typical to me. Now that I know, they kept their disagreements from Kimberly and me, but it was too late to assist. I had no idea how to move over a disagreement and continue trying to get married. Barbara took a deep breath and looked into Steve's eyes, hoping that even if he might not fully comprehend what she was saying, he would at least be able to relate to it enough to give her the benefit of the doubt. May we take a little trip back? Something that I forgot. You seem to be asking if there was ever a time when I made a decision to do something even though I knew it was bad. You were curious about how I decided to go forward nonetheless, she remarked. Steve nodded encouragingly, not sure this dialogue was going to go well at all, and he nearly regretted he hadn't begun it. Do you recall the stop sign? Barbara questioned him. Steve didn't know what she was talking about for a second until it dawned on him that it had been more than 6 years. The traffic signal, Mr. Houston inquired. He'd been listening to everything Barbara said, and while a lot of what she said was typical of wives who had strayed from their marriages, few of them understood how they'd fallen into the behavioral patterns they had. Barbara had made it a point to delve deeper than most women would or could. There had never been a stoplight discussion like this before, so this was unusual. It happened when we were still dating, Barbara recounted, turning to face the counselor only half of the way. Steve was driving, and 2 other couples were joining us somewhere. State Park, with a sigh from Steve. Yes, Barbara replied. We were planning a picnic on this small country road at a state park. This is in one of those tiny towns way out in the middle of nowhere. It was just a broad area on the road, but it was equipped with a stoplight. Steve pulled up and stopped since the light in the direction we were traveling in was red. Then he simply depressed the brake, stepped on the pedal, and drove away. We all searched for a deputy sheriff or one of those constables that patrol such small towns, but we were fortunate. She gave her hubby a smile. The issue is that it wasn't at all like Steve. When other people are in the car with him, he drives so cautiously. Among all the guys in our group, he was the only one who followed the speed limits, stopped completely, and other such rules. He used to tell me that he felt a lot of responsibility and wouldn't risk my injury when we were driving. I thought his delivery of it was excellent, Barbara added, grinning at her husband. Anyhow, Steve asked us what was going on when we had all quieted down, as if he was unaware of what he had just done. Barbara hesitated for a few heartbeats. He was shocked and then appalled when we told him. We could all tell after a time how upset he was about it. He was unaware of what he had done. Not that he'd run a red light, it's not something he did very often. The reason for this was that he couldn't recall thinking about doing it or not. She faced Steve once more. You do recall how you felt that day, sweetheart? Steve nodded, putting his head back on the backrest of the chair and exhaling deeply. He could see where Barbara was going, and he needed to check out the example his wife had suggested. He needed to clear his head. Steve replied, I don't remember. There was no thought process that I was aware of. Then when you guys started making fun of me for it, I didn't. I don't remember considering whether or not to pass the red light. He hesitated. Steve thought, I tried to explain it when you guys got mad at me. I claimed I must have realized in my head that there was no cross traffic at all and that I could drive on, but I'm not sure. He thought about it for a while. All right. With a sigh, Steve said, I see what you're saying. Though I'm not sure if I like it, I can't help but see your point of view. Individuals don't always use logic to justify their actions. They occasionally fail to notice what they're doing. They just go ahead and, well, crap, he remarked, looking weary. It makes me feel offended. Symmetry, I suppose, Steve remarked. I'd feel better at ease accepting that there is a mental process associated with each action a person performs. I should note that this isn't always the case, though. Without thinking twice, I ran the damn light. Without considering if it was good, bad, or neutral. There's simply no avoiding it. Steve sat up and gave his wife a straight look. He firmly stated, there's more to that than that. I've never unintentionally run a red light before. Not even once. Whenever I'm driving the front car in a queue of traffic and I approach a stoplight, I can't help but think back to that afternoon. I carry that memory with me to ensure that I never commit the same error twice. Barb, if you want to continue with this analogy, there can't be another moment like this for us. You must never underestimate the harm that comes from not paying attention. This marriage is only meant for 2 people. Barbara, I will not accept a third party. Never. Barbara, I promise not to go through this again. His spouse gave him a firmer handshake. Tears were pooling in her eyes. I understand, she remarked. Every time I think of what I've done with Jimmy and Rafe, I get sick to my stomach. I loathe the Barbara that did those things. I won't ever let the memory go, Steve. It'll always be there, waiting for me to make sure I never get off the straight and narrow ever again. Steve took a moment to study her features. Not so long ago, Barbara had slept with him despite all the evidence pointing to his having AIDS and her impending demise from the bond. Barbara had shown him a depth of love with that gesture that he had not thought she possessed for him. It had greatly contributed to the dismantling of their barriers. She was telling him now that it made her sick to think about what she had done with the other men. She was going to hold on to the painful memories to ensure she would never wander again. Steve sighed. This evening, he was doing a lot of that. It's okay, Steve replied. I can let it go, Barbara. I'm not the brightest guy in the world, but I can recognize logic when it smacks me in the face. He straightened his back in his chair and looked at his wife for a prolonged period of time. He looked over at Mr. Houston. So, would you say I've worked my way through all those steps in the grieving process you talked about that time? Steve said to the counselor. Vern was shocked. It took him a moment to recall the private therapy session he'd shared with Steve. He grinned. Mr. Houston said, I think you have, yes, Steve, and done it quite well too. Steve said, so we start on the smaller problems now. What's up first? Barbara said, hi, very briefly. Hello, sweetie, Steve answered. In order to prevent the noise from the outside building construction from overpowering the discussion, he pressed the cell phone closer to his ear. He inquired, what's up? Barbara inquired, are you alone? Steve responded, Lois and Jeff are at lunch and picking up some reports at the downtown office. All right, Barbara remarked. Is the door locked? Steve questioned. What? The weird talk had already confused the hell out of him. No, it's not locked, honey. Why? Why did you ask me that? There was a brief pause. Barbara had disregarded his question, saying, well, no one can see your laptop screen from the door. Or the windows, right? Steve was now absolutely perplexed. Well, if I pull the blinds on the windows right beside me. Yeah, he replied. Barbara asked, would you pull them, honey? Steve opened his mouth to ask why, but then changed his mind. With a sigh, he stood up and shut the two blinds. Okay, honey, they're closed. Now what's this all about, baby? Barbara said, you'll find out in just a minute, lover. Steve detected a hint of anxiety in her tone. He questioned the situation. Steve, you remember June, right? And her nephew, the computer guy. Yes, Steve answered. Yes, he did. Barbara's closest coworker friend was June. After Steve revealed Barbara's affair to the entire office, she had been her sole buddy for a considerable amount of time. June's nephew Wendell was a poster boy for geeks worldwide. Barbara remarked, well, they came over this morning. Now, she was undoubtedly a little anxious. Steve could definitely hear it. When Barbara stopped talking, Steve said, okay. Barbara, on the other end of the telephone, took a deep breath and exhaled sharply. Barbara said, well, Wendell helped me set up a web camera. Though she was unable to see it, Steve was frowning. He was clueless as to why his wife would desire a webcam installed in their house. With anxiety, honey, are you still there? She questioned. Steve said to her, oh, sorry, sweetheart. Just trying to process everything. Okay, she said, honey, can you put an RIP into Netscape? And, use port number 11547. Okay, yes, please give me a moment, Steve replied. Now he was curious. Was Barbara developing a new interest? Steve hurriedly looked around to make sure the Venetian blinds were closed. Okay, it's coming up. The firewall is stopping. Okay, I've allowed the connection. Damn, he could see the video streaming. There in the study off the living room was Barbara. He had a good view of her. His wife wore sheer black thigh-high heels. She looked stunning, and nothing more. She had her phone pressed up against her left ear. What are you doing, honey? He asked in a choked voice. Barbara, you like? Barbara asked with a happy sigh. Steve saw that she was beaming widely. She gave the camera a wave. Oh, God, Steve answered. Oh, you know I do, Barb. Did you just forget to tell me that June and Wendell weren't there anymore or? Barbara chuckled. Silly, they're gone, she murmured. Steve said, I see, in a harried tone. To observe more detail, he enlarged the viewing screen. He then reduced its size till he had the best image. His heart was pounding more quickly now. His lungs were straining to keep up. Steve, inquired Barbara, are you still there, honey? Yeah. Wait just a minute, he curtly replied. He threw down his cell phone and ran to the door to lock it firmly, but he could hear his wife laughing. I gotta go lock the door, he said into the phone. I'm back. Oh, that's good, Barbara mused. She questioned slyly, want to see something cool? Steve shot back, I already see something cool. Barbara laughed once again. Her words, I mean something better. Yes, Steve answered. She turned to face the camera and said, Barbara, are you starting some kind of dirty website or something? Just for you, sweetheart, she said. Just making sure, said Steve. Grinning at the camera, his spouse recalled what she had begun to accomplish. She swiveled around and widened her legs. She twisted at the waist, aimed the remote at the camera, and cast a sidelong glance at the little TV they kept in the study. She zipped closer till her face was in close-up. Her phone fell to the ground, momentarily revealing her hand. She leaned forward even further after bending over slowly and slightly adjusting the camera angle. Honey, inquired Barbara. Honey, her other hand had to be holding the phone. Steve questioned her ability to balance while hunched over like that. Steve muttered, yes, Barbie, I'm here, in response. With an enticing question, Steve, how long does it take you to get from the building site to here? I'll inform you, Steve replied. He got up and swung his chair back. The phone remained at his ear as he picked up his jacket and made his way to the door. Steve, honey, Barbara responded, did you remember to turn off your computer? Steve said, oh, Right, turning around before he could open the door. With the laptop under his arm, he snapped down the lid, unplugged the AC power cord, and sprinted for the outside door. He waited until the very last second to use the brakes, pulling the steering wheel sharply to the left and allowing the tires to screech loudly when he did. With his considerable momentum, he had to use the brakes forcefully to avoid colliding with the garage door. In a matter of seconds, he was out of the car and shoving his way through the open door. Just inside the doorway in the foyer, Barbara was on her knees resting on a throw cushion. Finally, Barbara laughed and Steve murmured, "Honey, I don't know what brought that on, but you can do it again anytime you want to, okay?" It was a brief chuckle. She was at her breathless best. She gave him her word, "We will," in between panties. "But there's a bunch of things we used to do, you know," she said. "We need to do those lots again. We should never have stopped, honey." Steve responded, "There's no debate here." He inquired, "What else do you want to do?" "Well," Barbara replied slowly, "I've heard some people kind of baptize every room in their house by having bonding somewhere there." "Yes," Barbara answered. She remarked carefully, "I think we're behind on that. We have 3 or 4 rooms we haven't done it in yet." Conclusion. Steve observed the sun setting toward the western horizon while relaxing on the rear deck. He was content with his life. With 18 months of experience in his new role, he was starting to make a name for himself in the downtown boardroom. All things considered, his life was pretty damn good and his marriage was back on track. The fall had arrived well in advance. The prediction called for frost for the weekend in the hill area. Right now, it was kind of cool, but not really cool. Behind him, he could hear Barbara humming contentedly in the kitchen. She had determined that the perfect way to round off the day would be with a drink of hot chocolate. It had taken them 2 years or more to arrive. It wasn't a simple task. For a long while, Steve had been fighting it tooth and claw. They would never have survived if his employer hadn't effectively forced him to accompany Barbara to counseling. Steve laughed at the recollection. He and Barbara had noticed the CEO and CFO of the company where Steve worked, along with their spouses, seated at a table at the previous 4th of July picnic. Barbara's grandmother was also present. Steve had expressed amazement that he had no idea Lydia knew them. Everyone in the group had laughed. Lydia told him that she had known these 2 guys and their spouses since they were little children playing together in a sandbox with the same toys. Steve realized all of a sudden how and why he and Barbara had been fired from the company, and why the policy on married senior workers had been suddenly changed. He had cast Lydia a scathing glance. She had made no attempt to refute it. She laughed and asked him to sue her. She stated she hoped he'd never have to pay her back, but he promised to do so. He could only ask her to get up so they could share a long embrace. Hell, for a long while, the therapy had been the reason that kept Barbara and him in each other's lives. Now he saw the bright side of it. At the moment, he had believed the contrary. In the weekly counseling session, they had worked through most of the effects Barbara's straying had on Steve. Mr. Houston mediated between them as they tackled issues that had existed before the adultery and remained thereafter. He had also given them strategies to ensure that their communication would not break down once more. They'd pretty much worked their way over the problem of not having enough physical intimacy. Together with Steve, Barbara had found her own eager side again, and they quickly led busy and interesting lives. There were additional challenging issues. Barbara claimed to be insecure, but in reality, she had a highly confident husband who always seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go in life, how to get there, and what he would do once he got there. But Barbara had to grow up a lot as a result of having to deal with the fallout from her own infidelity, and that development significantly raised her confidence level. Ultimately, the insecurity had been something that could be resolved on its own. Actually, the smaller issues became immediately manageable after the larger ones involving Barbara's adultery were settled. All it needed was time. These days, they put a lot of effort into their union. They would not accept one another for granted. After placing 2 steaming mugs on the patio table next to Steve, Barbara slipped into his arms and onto his lap. He gave her a firm embrace, and she huddled up to give him a kiss. "Darling, the back room where you have all the camping gear and stuff," Barbara replied softly. "I think we should clear all that out," she stated, "and put it out in the garage or somewhere. What do you think?" Steve paused to reflect. The equipment was in the bedroom at the back for no discernible reason. The garage offered an abundance of storage space, and it might even make more sense to keep the items outside. Simpler, for example, to load into the pickup. He took one look at his hot cocoa and said, "Okay, I'll get it done this weekend." He also determined it needed to cool down a little more. In a casual manner, he inquired, "What do you want to do with the room?" The waning light cast a charming backlight on the meager clouds. In his head, he wondered if he need to go grab his camera. Barbara said to him, "Well, we can use it for a bedroom, like it was intended." Compared to Steve, she preferred her drinks hotter. She quickly swigged. Steve said, continuing to take in the sunset. "Okay," Barbara said, "we're going to need the extra space for a nursery, with caution." Steve was so distracted that it took him a moment to process what his wife had said. "In about 7.5 months, Barbara said, "so you've got lots of time to clear it out." "Oh, my God," Steve said. Barbara inquired, "Are you happy?" Her voice carried only a hint of doubt. Steve embraced his wife even more tightly. He ran his lips over hers and let that be his response. It was not until much after darkness turned into night that they realized the sun had set. My comment: I had no problem with the story until he apologized to Barbara. Steve has no reason to apologize to Barbara. Their marriage was over and he owed her nothing. However, he shouldn't have had slept with sis-in-law even after everything Barbara did.